presents Earth rhythms and cosmic patterns, solar outbursts, and cycles of civilization.
So I'm very pleased to be here, and I want to thank Chris and Grant for bringing me. It's a real honor and pleasure. And I have not been to Toronto for I don't know how many decades, so it's a pleasure to be back.
Welcome.
So this is EarthRhythms, and I want to talk about first my early work. As you heard, I went to Yale University, my PhD in geology and geophysics, so I'm a genuine academic. I've been teaching at Boston University since 1984 as a full-time I'm now a tenured faculty member. I really got involved in the antiquity business, if you would, looking at origins of civilization in 1990 when I first went to Egypt, and that's a young picture of me on the far right, standing next to a fellow named John Anthony West. Does anyone know who that is? Yeah. And he's the one that got me involved in all this, as he once said to me, boondoggle. So what was going on when I first got involved in this, and this is still the standard story, and that is that back before about 3,500 BC, before the rise of civilization, humans were nothing more than hunter-gatherers at best. They didn't build cities, they didn't carve big structures. The rise of civilization did not occur until about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. The Sphinx, I was told, was carved in 2500 BC, from scratch, end of story. And one of the characteristics of civilization is monumental stone carving, stone structures. So you just don't get that before about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. That was, and still is in many people's minds, the conventional paradigm. But geology, and I found this very early on, 25 years ago, geology exposes a problem with this story. Specifically, the Sphinx, which sits on the edge of the Sahara Desert, which has been hyper-arid for the last 5,000 years, shows evidence that it must go back to an earlier period. So I was studying the core body and the enclosing walls of the Sphinx. Enclosure, here you see the Sphinx, and can everyone see, I'm sure you can see how it was carved down into the bedrock. And the thing is, when you look at these walls, it's not difficult geology. This is really classic sort of, as some people would say, geology 101. This is not the type of weathering and erosion you find from Sahara Desert conditions. And so that immediately suggested to me, when I say immediately, within seconds of actually being there, that there's something amiss, that this may go back to an earlier period. And what you find, just to show you, the rock layers are composed of softer and harder layers. The softer layers are more easily removed, but you get a very different texture, a very different pattern from rain versus wind. And you see this on the Sahara. There's wind weathering on the Giza Plateau. This is not far from the Sphinx. It's almost stone throwing distance. Do you see how that looks very different? It's sort of a wind tunnel feature versus there's younger me in the Sphinx enclosure, myself per scale, and you get this rounded, undulating profile in these fissures. I went back there earlier this year to visit the same site. And the features are still there, fortunately. Well, why wouldn't they be? So, protracted rains, and you get this, but why would you have protracted rains when supposedly this was carved out only 4,500 years ago? Why would you get these features? And the answer to me seemed fairly obvious, that the earlier portion of the Sphinx goes back to an earlier climatic regime. And initially, I suggested that must go back to at least 5,000 to 7,000 BC or earlier. The problem was, this is before civilization was supposed to have existed. Everyone with me?
Yeah.
So some people got pretty upset about that. And what happened with the Sphinx is that the head was recarved. So it was an older head that was also badly eroded and weathered. But they recarved the head. They actually used little blocks to carve the body. So maybe it was a Sphinx originally. I suspect it was actually a lion. and that was a lion's head. Not imagine that over 20 years later I would still be talking about this, because they were going to stifle me, and they were going to do it by 1992, having a debate. They threw it together very quickly to debate me on the age of the Sphinx. So this was at their meeting, American Association for the Advancement of Science annual meeting. They held a special conference, if you would, or sub-meeting to debate the age of the Sphinx. And I'll boil it down. I presented all the geological evidence, much more than I just ran through a few seconds ago. I gave all kinds of detailed evidence, and the Egyptologists and the archaeologists were represented by Mark Lehner, and this is a direct quote from him, because he wanted to make sure it was, everyone knew about it, so it was published in the New York Times. He said, if the Sphinx was built by an earlier culture, where's the evidence of that civilization? Where's the evidence of that civilization? Where are the pottery shards? Because do people realize that archaeologists like little broken things? So, where are the pottery shards? People during that age were what? Hunters and gatherers, because that was the paradigm, that was the dogma. They didn't build cities, because he realized that if the Sphinx was older, it had major implications. So 1992, this is 1992, everyone have that in their head? Mm-hmm. Yes, because years later, I couldn't really answer it because he had the first evidence. It's like finding the first dinosaur bone. If you're going to throw that away and say it doesn't exist, then there's nothing. Then you find another one. Now this is the first one. We throw it away, it doesn't exist, now there's nothing. You see my point? And this is a site in southeastern Turkey. This is an overview of the site that my wife took. And he's been started excavating in 1999. It's near Urfa, the city of Urfa. If anyone knows the city of Urfa, it's a traditional home of the biblical patriarch Abraham, at least according to the tradition of northern Mesopotamia. And what caught my attention is he was talking about major building phases, 10,000 to 8,000 BC, the period I've been talking about informally as Sphinx Age. And here he had independent evidence that the Egyptologists asked for of culture, of civilization, going back thousands of years earlier. Just to give you the location, can you see the red dot? It's in northern Mesopotamia versus where you see Baghdad. That would be middle and southern Mesopotamia, which is the traditional emergence of civilization, 3,000 to 4,000 BC. This goes back much earlier, and he was dating it initially to even before my Sphinx date. And this is, like I said, he was with the German Archaeological Institute, absolutely meticulous work, no question about it. I just want to show you a few pictures. It's an amazing site. The site consists of these stone circles or rings. Can you see the ring? Sort of Stonehenge-like, but if you have an image of Stonehenge in your mind, 2 points. One, these are much more sophisticated, much more finely carved, and according to the traditional dating of this Stonehenge monument, although now things are being found that date the overall site earlier, which I'm not surprised by, the traditional dating of Stonehenge only goes back to about 3,000 or so BC, 2,600 BC or so. This, we're talking 9,000 to 10,000 BC. So far, these megalithic stone circles, 4 have been significantly excavated. There's probably 20 or more located on this site. Most of them have been found by geophysical techniques, ground penetrating radar, seismic, that type of thing. I'm always a skeptic in the best sense of the word, not a debunker, as many skeptics really are, but I want to know what is the evidence. I want to follow the evidence, and I was very concerned about the evidence for the date on this. Yes, my own data with the Sphinx pushed things back, but was this real, or was the dating wrong? And we talked about it at great length. I've read all the papers on it, and I'm absolutely convinced that yes, this really does go back to that earlier period. Just a few summary of it. The largest pillars are 10 to 15 tons. Notice this one. Again, that's another view of it. Do you see how it has arms and a belt and a loincloth? So they're beautifully carved. They're set into the bedrock very shallowly with what Dr. Schmidt believed was some kind of concrete. And important to the dating, the entire site was covered over by 10,000 years ago, by 8,000 BC. It was purposefully covered over intentionally, not like most archaeological sites where they're just sort of left to the wind, left to the time and elements, they're abandoned, maybe there's a war, that type of thing. This was purposefully covered over, and once that was done, you can look at basically the minerals that form. If you think of a limestone cave with stalactites and stalagmites, essentially the same thing happened here. On a micro level, those can be dated, so dated that the entire site was sealed by 10,000 years ago, and the site itself goes back much earlier. Some of the dates on it go back to about 95, 97, 9800 BC. And again, I'll come to it, those are actually dates on secondary structures, not on the actual pillars, which go back further than that. I teach at Boston University, when I show this to some of the young women, they commented, oh, designer belt, 10,000 BC. Does it look like that? And what is going on here? You see consistent symbols, not just on the belt, but otherwise. You see the belt buckle, you see sort of the H shapes and the C shapes. I would not put it past these ancient people. They had some kind of symbolic writing, some kind of symbolic, would we dare say literacy? They're not supposed to happen that early. But think about today. If all our civilization were destroyed except for a few, signs that were carved in rocks, and you just had a few initials or letters, what would people extract from that? So I think there's a lot more to learn about this, and they're probably even more sophisticated than we realize. Okay, what is important here? I want to get to another main point. There is evidence of catastrophe before that intentional burial. Look at this picture again. Do you see what's happening with that pillar? This pillar was knocked down. It was hastily re-erected. You see how it was re-erected? This is not the archaeologists doing this. This is what they did in ancient times. These walls, do you see these walls here? These are secondary walls. Still over 10,000 years old, but they're secondary walls put in crudely to prop these pillars back into position after they were knocked down. And as Schmidt said to me, and he's published this before he passed away on several occasions, Göbekli Tepe was intentionally buried at least by 8,000 BC. Depending on how you interpret the dates, it could be more like 8,800, 9,000 BC. And they spent as much energy basically to build a little artificial mountain over it as they did to erect it initially. So they were very serious about covering it over, preserving it somehow, preserving what they had built. And the question is why? Why were they doing this? So the dating of Göbekli Tepe goes back to the last ice age. So searching for the answer to this question of what's happening at Göbekli Tepe takes us back to the end of the last ice age and what is happening there. What is happening there? There's a huge sudden warming at the end of the last ice age. And just to give you a little bit of background on the end of the last ice age, it didn't just warm up and that was it, the end of the last ice age. It was actually gradually warming. There was a cooling, a brief period of cooling, essentially a cold snap that began in 10,900 BC. This is known as the Younger Dryas. Sometimes people say, well, what does Younger Dryas mean? The Dryas is a little flower, a little alpine flower that flourished at the time. So it became more prominent when it was colder at high latitudes. So that lasts about 1,200 years. And then there's a final warming and a sudden snap out of the last ice age, dramatic warming, 9,700 BC, which is precisely Göbekli Tepe time, for the oldest portions of Göbekli Tepe. Look at this. Those little gray bars at the top, the little gray boxes, you see those? Those mark years. What this is going from older to younger. Here's 1 year, another year, another year. These 3 years are still the Younger Dryas. They mark Holocene. This is the end of the last ice age. This is the first year after the end of the last ice age. You with me? And not only do we know to which year it is, but we know, based on isotope data and what's happening temperature-wise, and a whole slew of geochemical markers, we can they pinpoint here, not just to the year, but you see how within the year, we're talking literally weeks, probably days, if we could have the resolution. This literally happened overnight. So it's not even a metaphor, it happened overnight, and we really mean 10 years or 100 years. We're talking literally. I mean, it's really mind-boggling if you think about it. And not only did something happen in the geochemical markers, in the climate, etc., there were what? Mass extinctions of animals. And this is a paper that came out in 2009 analyzing when did these mass extinctions really occur, because you have to take into account your last occurrence in the geological record, but how does that match with the actual extinction, etc., etc. And you'll notice that they all clump at this line. 9700 BC is when they're occurring. So something very dramatic is happening at 9700 BC. So the end of the last ice age, really I want everyone to understand it's 9700 BC, and we have to figure out what caused it. I do want to address one issue very quickly. That is the beginning of the Younger Dryas, 2900 BC. If you were students, I'd ask you to take a quiz now. What happened in 10,000? Did I say 2,900? 10,900 BC. 10,900 BC, what happened then? Younger Dryas, it got colder. Colder, 10,900 BC. 9,700 BC, end of the Younger Dryas, and it got warmer. Everyone with me? And it got dramatically warmer, much warmer than the amount it got cold. So they pulled us right out of the Ice Age. So there's those two different events, and people get them mixed up all the time. So 10,900 BC is colder. Some people have suggested that maybe there was a comet. Actually, I say controversial there. It's essentially, the evidence is not there for a comet. And the comet is also not a comet, which doesn't exist, is not what would explain the end of the last ice age. But even things like Science News got it wrong when they had a headline, Ice Age ends smashingly, did a comet blow up over eastern Canada? Number one, the evidence for a comet is not there, despite what other people say. And it didn't end that was not the end of the last ice age anyway. Are you with me? Yeah, so there's two different things, and recent work, and I have been following this in great detail. There's been so many misidentifications in the literature as to what's going on during the Younger Dryas, and people were mistaking what they call nanodiamonds. They're mistaking other elements for that, or other minerals, etc., etc. So there's real problems with that, but it's not actually my big concern right now anyway, because my concern is what actually ended the last ice age. And a comet seemed like too easy a principle anyway, too easy. You know, it's like one person said to me, if it seems too simple, it probably is too simple, and it's probably a more complex situation. I just like the title of this paper. The Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, a requiem. You know what a requiem is? Basically, for the dead. The hypothesis is dead. But if it's not a comet, and a comet wouldn't even make sense for bringing us out of the ice age, because what would a comet do? Those of us that are old enough might remember the concept of a nuclear what? winter, nuclear winter, would throw dust and debris into the atmosphere. It would cause a cooling effect. So it did make some sense for maybe the beginning of the Younger Dryas, although it turns out the evidence when you analyze this does not hold up to scrutiny. But what happened at the end of the last ice age? And I believe, and I'm going to show you a little bit of the evidence, that the science now points to the sun, that it was a major solar outburst that hit the Earth in 9700 BC, that literally snapped us out of the last ice age. And the sun is sometimes quiet, sometimes it's not. You have to realize that the sun is a what? Come on. Star. It is a star. Other stars go through cycles. Other stars do not shine with the same luminosity all the time. Other stars are not nice and stable, as one person said to me, and I think I've read this too, that you could see the concept that most people have in their minds that our sun is the same perfect, eternal, unchanging object in the sky as one of the last vestiges of Aristotelian thinking. That somehow it's perfect, it doesn't change, it doesn't do anything. Well, no, that's not the case. It's incredibly vibrant, and it's incredibly fickle, if you would, if you think about anthropomorphically. And it goes through cycles. Sometimes the sun undergoes major solar outbursts. These go by different names, things like coronal mass ejections, solar flares, there's different types of them. And sometimes it can give off huge plasma discharges, that's basically electrically charged particles, and they can, in some cases, come toward the Earth. They can hit the Earth. If you have a major plasma outburst hitting the Earth, it'll cause massive destruction on Earth. It'll dramatically warm the climate. If you're in an ice age, it's going to melt the ice. The Greenland ice core data, the sediment core data, if you analyze it, lunar data, all indicate that something happened in 9700 BC simultaneously, instantaneously, and the isotope data in particular is very convincing that this was a major solar outburst. Besides ice core data, sediment core data, lunar data, ancient vitrification, which I've only mentioned very briefly now because we have limited time. Something else that's very important is in the archaeological record, you get indications of this. One in particular that I've become fascinated with is petroglyphs, ancient petroglyphs. And I need to introduce Anthony Perrott, who's a plasma physicist with Los Alamos National Laboratory. He studies high-energy plasma physics in the universe, whether it's our sun or other stars. Oh, just a little picture. Everyone knows what plasma is? You should be familiar with it. It's the stuff in neon tubes. In fact, it's been said that there's 4 states of matter: solid, liquid, gas, and plasma, and most of the universe is actually plasma. Actually, high-energy charged particles. We just aren't as familiar with it because we're not plasma individuals. But he started, and I remember talking to him about this about 15 years ago now. He got into this because he's at Los Alamos. So he would go out, camping and hiking, and he would see these Indian petroglyphs. And certain ones that were very, very ancient, he said, actually looked a lot like plasma discharges he was studying in the laboratory. And what he came to conclude, after a lot of work on it, is that in fact they were recording as petroglyphs, scratching on rocks, what they were seeing in the sky. Everyone make sense? Yeah. And he pointed out, essentially, as I said, northern and southern lights, it would become much more intense. In some cases, it would form things that look like this. This is from the radiation, what they call synchrotron radiation. These figures, it looks sort of like a human stick figure. But something that's very diagnostic is they have these weird things on their sides. I mean, most people don't have little donuts independent of them, floating around with them, etc. So, this is not just, So he found different things, the stick figures, different classes of shapes, stick figures with sort of the donuts on the sides, the dots on the side. Something else I want to mention here is he would get some that were sort of stick figure shapes with birds' heads, what looked like birds on them, which is a very common motif if you know ancient cultures of bird-headed men, which I think may go back to this early period, and also things that were sort of donut-like, cylindrical, cascading cylindrical shapes, that type of thing. So number of diagnostic forms, and he and his researchers, he and his colleagues start looking for these, and they found them in now over 130 countries around the world, all looking very similar. I just showed you a few examples from his work: Italy, Spain, Arizona, Armenia, the UAE. Notice here's some of the ones where they start to take on birds' heads or bird shapes on the top of them. And I want to be clear, it's not that all petroglyphs represent this, because there are many petroglyphs that were made in the 19th century, many petroglyphs everywhere from 10,000, 12,000 years ago to the present day. We're looking at a very ancient class of petroglyphs that is found around the world, which seems to record, bottom line, a major solar outburst. Here are some more from the UAE and in Saudi Arabia. I was speaking a year or two ago in Norway. So if I'm in Norway, I wanted to go see, because they told me there were some petroglyphs, so we spent a day hiking out and driving out to see the petroglyphs. This is what we found. Don't they look similar? The basic distinctive plasma shapes. I asked, well, how old are these? What's their best estimate? End of the last ice age. And furthermore, they had a tradition, I want to read this to you, and this was independently recorded long before we were thinking about such things. A tradition in the days of Roko Hitau, and that was one of the traditional sort of leaders or kings of Easter Island. In the days of Roko Hitau, the sky fell from above onto the earth. The people cried out, "The sky has fallen." In the days of King Roko Hitau, he took hold. He waited a given time. The sky returned. It went away and stayed up there. And I think this could be how you would describe a major solar outburst. It would last a certain period of time. All havoc would break loose, if you would, but then it would sort of cure itself after the fact. There's this time frame, this period, when advanced civilizations were essentially wiped out and we were thrown back. So a major solar outburst explains the sudden melting of the glaciers. It would release pressure on the crust. It would set off earthquake and volcanic activity. Do we have evidence for this at the end of the last ice age? Absolutely. In 9700 BC. It would be various floods and deluges of biblical proportions, because you evaporate all this water and ice. It has to go somewhere. It goes into the atmosphere. It's not going to stay there forever. It comes down as what? Rains, torrential rains, which is what we have records of, including on the Sphinx. And I now think that those major initial torrential rains may actually go back to that period. You get depletion of the ozone layer, the stratospheric ozone. You will have lots of radiation on the surface of the Earth, which would kill large mammals within a few days in some cases. What goes extinct? Primarily large mammals. You'd have changes, of course, in atmospheric and oceanic circulation, and in some places you would literally incinerate the surface of the Earth, where it happened to touch down. Again, I use the analogy of a tornado. You have a huge tornado. It may touch down some places, and right next to it, it doesn't. So, it's not the entire surface, but certain spots. But it would set wildfires, that type of thing. It would end the last ice age. I just want to point out, if this happened today, what would happen to us? We'd be gone. I mean, modern civilization as we know it would be gone.